With Resident Evil 9 finally out, we can now understand the full story of Grace Ashcroft. In this video, I'm breaking down her entire lore, from Resident Evil Outbreak all the way to the events of Resident Evil 9. If you enjoy the video, like and subscribe. The central irony of Grace Ashcroft lies in the fact that she has lived for nearly 30 years as the most critical figure in the biological landscape without possessing a single shred of awareness regarding her own importance. While the world watched the fall of Raccoon City and the subsequent rise of global bioterrorism, Grace lived a life of quiet, deliberate obscurity. She was a ghost in the making, a person whose very existence was a secret kept even from herself. This lack of knowledge was not an accident. It was the foundational requirement for the final plan set in motion by the architect of the nightmare, Oswell E. Spencer. He ensured she remained off the grid while the viral world he built matured into a permanent part of global society. To understand Grace is to understand the concept of a master key that doesn't know what door it belongs to. Spencer designed her role in the global security landscape decades before she was even old enough to walk, viewing her as the singular insurance policy against the very world he had spent his life corrupting. In the clinical logic of the Umbrella Corporation's founder, Grace was the only element of his legacy that remained untouched by the science of the T-virus. She was a human safeguard intended to outlast the corporations, the militaries, and the pathogens that sought to claim his final secrets. Her life is the 30-year intersection of her mother's 1998 survival, the trauma of a 2018 murder, and the modern emergence of Raccoon City syndrome. Spencer's interest in Grace was never about mutation or weaponization, which makes her an anomaly in the history of the franchise. For decades, the series has focused on the evolution of monsters, but Grace represents the preservation of the human. Spencer kept her off the grid, ensuring she remained a civilian, far removed from the laboratories of the biodefense apparatus. He wanted her to grow up honest, in a world built on lies, believing that her lack of connection to Umbrella was the only thing that would make her a reliable guardian for his final project. She was the only thing he created that was meant to stay soft and untouched by the pharmaceutical myth. This deliberate isolation ensured that Grace remained a blank slate, a person with no memory of the facility or the project she was born to protect. By the time the events of Resident Evil Requiem begin, she has built a wall between herself and the world, hiding behind a desk at the bureau to avoid the very history she carries in her blood. She is a data analyst who believes her only value is her ability to process case files, unaware that her genomic signature is the most valuable commodity on the global black market. She is the solution that believes it is just a person, waiting for a revelation she has never sought. The importance of Grace is rooted deeply in the blood of her mother, Alyssa. Because Alyssa survived the Raccoon City incident and successfully cured herself with the daylight vaccine, her biology was permanently altered. These daylight antibodies are exactly what Victor Gideon wants to harvest, as they represent a unique biological resistance developed during the city's final hours. Grace is the literal fulfillment of the pharmaceutical legacy, a person whose very survival is tied to the most advanced antigen ever developed. She is the biological legacy that Spencer chose to atone for his sins, a foundling he considered his only hope for a world he realized he had broken. Before she became a mother or a survivor, Alyssa Ashcroft was a woman of relentless curiosity and professional steel. As an investigative reporter for the Raccoon Press, she was one of the few individuals who looked at the Arklay Mountains and saw something other than a scenic landscape. Along with her partner, Kurt Diamond, Alyssa was already chasing the shadow of the Umbrella Corporation long before the T-virus reached the city streets. She was a hunter of truth, a woman who understood that the secrets of the Spencer Mansion were a threat to every living soul in the Midwest. This professional drive is the foundation of the legacy Grace would later inherit. However, Alyssa's path was compromised before the outbreak even began. During a failed investigation into the clandestine activities of the pharmaceutical giant, she encountered the cold, clinical reach of Dr. Greg Muller. To protect the company's research, Muller utilized experimental techniques to wipe her memory, leaving her disoriented and vulnerable. This act of intellectual violation was Alyssa's first personal encounter with the institutional evil of the corporation. She was a reporter who had her most valuable tools stolen from her, forced to navigate the upcoming disaster with a fractured mind and a missing history, trapped in a city about to be consumed by its own creation. When the T-virus finally tore through the urban center in September 1998, Alyssa found herself trapped in a city that had become a biological abattoir. Despite her memory loss and her mounting terror, her reporter's instinct remained intact. The confirmed events of the Resident Evil Outbreak series show her moving through the streets as a witness of historical significance, documenting the horrors that the government was already preparing to cover up. She saw the shambling remains of her neighbors and the clinical deployment of bioorganic weapons. She recording the evidence that would eventually bankrupt the most powerful company in the world. During the chaos of the escape, Alyssa was infected with the Epsilon strain of the T-virus through contaminated water. This was the moment her story shifted from a professional investigation to a biological struggle for survival. She did not just observe the plague, she became a host for it. In a testament to her tenacity, she successfully managed to procure and administer the daylight vaccine. This cure did more than just save her life. It permanently altered her blood chemistry. The vaccine interacted with the T-virus in a way that created a unique, stable antibody profile that would eventually be passed down to her daughter. The experience of surviving Raccoon City left Alyssa with a perspective that was both cynical and deeply protective. She understood that the fire in the mountains hadn't solved the problem. It had only buried the evidence. This realization shaped the rest of her life and the way she would eventually raise Grace. She saw the world through the lens of a survivor who knew that the system was complicit in the slaughter. Her survival was an act of defiance, a refusal to let the truth be sanitized by a thermobaric strike. The reporter who once sought the front page now sought the deepest shadows to keep her daughter hidden from the science that nearly destroyed her. After escaping the tactical strike that leveled her home, Alyssa Ashcroft did not retreat into a quiet life of trauma. Instead, she utilized her position to launch the most significant journalistic assault in the history of the bioweapons era. Her exposé, titled, "What is a BOW?" Blowing the lid off this horrifying secret project, was the definitive document that brought the reality of the T-virus to the global public. This article served as the primary evidence in the 2003 Raccoon trials, providing the testimony and the data needed to finally bankrupt the Umbrella Corporation. Alyssa proved that a pen could be just as lethal as a weapon when aimed at the heart of a corporate conspiracy. The impact of this article on the corporation's public legitimacy cannot be overstated. It stripped away the mask of a benevolent pharmaceutical company and revealed the industrial abattoir that lay beneath. Alyssa's work forced the international community to acknowledge the existence of bioorganic weapons, leading to a massive shift in global security policy. She remained skeptical of the new organizations that rose to replace Umbrella, viewing them as nothing more than sanitized successors to Spencer's vision. She understood that the system was trying to co-opt the truth rather than resolve the rot, and she continued her investigations long after the world had declared the war over. Her commitment to the truth was confirmed years later when she authored the report on the disappearances in Dulvey Parish, Louisiana. This document, found within the Baker house during the events of Resident Evil 7, proves that Alyssa was still active and still circling the activities of the connections. She was one of the few people who noticed the pattern of the mold era before it exploded into a global crisis. This direct lore thread connects the survivors of the 98 era to the modern biological threats, showing that Alyssa never stopped being a hunter of the dark. She was the constant variable that the bioweapons industry could never fully silence. The cost of being right in a world built on lies was a life of permanent surveillance and isolation. Alyssa understood that women who expose this kind of systemic power tend to become targets rather than heroes. She lived with the knowledge that the people she exposed were still moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the genomic intelligence she carried. This shaped her relationship with Grace, as she tried to balance her duty to the truth with her need to protect her daughter. She wanted Grace to have a normal life, yet she knew that the child's DNA was a piece of proprietary research that the corporations would eventually come for. Alyssa's investigation into the connections was her final and most dangerous mission. She was beginning to understand that the Syndicate was an architecture that predated even the Umbrella era, a deeper and more ancient rot that had been managing the biological nightmare for over a century. Her pursuit of this truth led her to the Wrenwood Hotel in 2018, a location that would become the site of her final stand. She died not as a victim, but as a journalist who had pushed too far into the secrets of the board of directors. Her death was the clinical price for a lifetime of honesty, leaving her daughter to carry the weight of everything she had seen. In the final years of his life, Oswell E. Spencer experienced a shift in ideology that was less about redemption and more about a clinical recognition of failure. The ARK interview disc, geo-recording recovered from a secret laboratory, reveals a man who understood that the biological world he had built was a structural disaster. He knew that the T-virus and its derivatives were inherently unstable, and that the global force intended to manage them was already corrupt. His endgame was not to save humanity, but to create a reset for a world he realized he had broken. This reset was embodied in the person of a foundling he chose to name Grace. Grace was a normal baby, completely unaltered by any of the horrific experiments that defined the Umbrella era. This was the defining characteristic that Spencer valued above all else. He viewed her as a clean slate, a human variable that was not contaminated by the hubris of his science. By keeping her a foundling and ensuring she was raised away from the laboratories, he was attempting to preserve a version of humanity that he had otherwise destroyed. He considered this child his hope, the one thing he created that was not a weapon. It was a dying man's attempt at a personal atonement through the preservation of an ordinary life. The choice of Alyssa Ashcroft to raise Grace was a calculated and deeply cynical act of trust. Spencer understood that Alyssa was the only person who had successfully beaten Umbrella with truth rather than violence. He needed someone who would keep Grace away from the influence of the bioweapons industry, someone who had a moral spine that could not be broken by corporate bribes. By entrusting his final project to the reporter who survived Raccoon City, he was ensuring that Grace would grow up in an environment of honesty and skepticism. He chose the one woman who likely hated him most to be the guardian of his only hope for salvation. The word Elpis, the Greek spirit of hope, and the name of the final project is a key to understanding Spencer's psychological state. In the myth of Pandora, hope was the final thing in the box, the one element that could mitigate the suffering released upon the world. Spencer viewed the T-virus as the evils of the box, and Grace as the Elpis that remained. He intended for her to be the key to a universal antigen, a biological reset that could render his viral weapons inert. The man who spent his life playing God chose hope as his final password, a late and desperate reach for a recovery he did not deserve. The ARC facility terminal requires a vocal input that only Grace can provide. But this isn't a programmed command or a subconscious trigger. Instead, the access is designed to be unlocked through emotional memory and the synthesis of her past. When faced with the final question, Grace arrives at the answer organically through her grief. She hears her mother's voice in her mind, and she hears Spencer's recording, both identifying her as hope. By speaking the word aloud, she is not following a directive, but accepting a role she was born to play. It is a moment where memory and mission collide, proving that Spencer's hope relied on the human spirit rather than a mechanical lock. The night of the 2018 murder at the Wrenwood Hotel is the defining trauma that split Grace Ashcroft's life into two halves. Alyssa had taken the 16-year-old Grace to the hotel to meet a whistleblower who claimed to have evidence of a new breed of obedience-based bioweapons. The atmosphere was one of professional tension and maternal protection. However, the meeting was a trap designed to neutralize the reporter who had been circling the connections for years. A mysterious phone call cut the power to the facility, plunging the hallway into a darkness that would forever haunt Grace's memory. In the shadows of that hallway, an unidentified hooded assailant executed the hotel manager before turning their attention to Alyssa. Despite making it to another part of the building, the investigative journalist was ultimately killed off-screen, a fact that left her daughter paralyzed by terror and unresolved grief. The identity of this killer remains ambiguous in the confirmed lore, with some evidence pointing toward Victor Gideon's operation, though the specific assailant is never definitively unmasked. This violence created a state of permanent trauma for Grace, who watched her mother die in a hotel that would eventually become her own cage. The murder was a clinical removal of a tactical liability, ending the career of the woman who had exposed Umbrella's original crimes. Gideon likely needed the mother removed to clear the way for his eventual focus on Grace, whom he viewed as a ripening biological asset. By removing Alyssa, the Shadow Network ensured that Spencer's hope remained unprotected and easier to monitor. This turns the tragedy into a piece of calculated logistics, a move to ensure that the secrets of the ARC facility would eventually fall into the hands of those who sought to exploit them. Grace's psychological defense mechanisms created a state of partial suppression regarding the visceral details of the violence. For nearly a decade, she has lived with the ghost of that night, She unable to fully process the face of the figure who stole her mother's life. This silence has defined her professional and personal isolation, leading her to seek a life where she would never have to walk into a dark hallway again. She spent 7 years trying to outrun a history that was always waiting for her to return to the site of her mother's death. Watching her mother die is the emotional anchor that connects Grace to the other survivors of the series. She knows what it means to be the one who is left behind, to be the witness to a slaughter that nobody is supposed to know about. This shared trauma is what eventually allows her to trust Leon Kennedy when the investigation returns to the hotel years later. They are both people who have been hollowed out by the Umbrella legacy, two ghosts who are trying to find a reason to keep fighting in a world that wants them to disappear. The night at the Renwood was her personal Raccoon City, the moment her world was vaporized by ambition. Following the 2018 tragedy at the Wrenwood Hotel, Grace Ashcroft entered a state of prolonged psychological and social isolation. She spent the next 7 years moving through the world like a spectral figure, a person who had been hollowed out by a violence she could not fully process. This period of silence was not an act of peace, but an act of deliberate avoidance. She built a wall between herself and the curiosity that had killed her mother, choosing a life of data and reports over a life of investigation and risk. She was trying to outrun a biological debt that she did not even know she owed. In March 2025, Grace joined the FBI, but her choice of career was the opposite of her mother's investigative spirit. She did not seek a platform to expose the truth. She sought a system to hide within, and by specializing as an intelligence analyst, she ensured that she would remain behind a desk, far removed from the field where her mother had died. She wanted to be a cog in the machinery of the state, believing that the institutional power of the Bureau would provide a safety that her mother's journalism never could. She chose the safety of the archive over the danger of the front page, hiding in the very system that was tracking her. The portrait of Grace during this time is one of a person who has built a perfectly functional prison for herself. Her desk at the FBI is a monument to her professional focus and her personal detachment, cluttered with files on mundane technicalities. Her superior, Nathan Dempsey, regarded her primarily as a high-level technical analyst with zero field experience, a classification that Grace encouraged to stay stationary. She did not want to be a hero. She wanted to be invisible. She was a woman who had successfully turned her trauma into a desk job, unaware that the system she was hiding in was already archiving her genomic signature for the harvest. The 7-year gap between the murder and joining the Bureau implies a depth of grief that Grace has never fully addressed. She has spent her adulthood in a state of stasis, waiting for a finality that never came. This silence is what makes her so vulnerable when the Raccoon City syndrome begins to emerge. She has no support network and no real understanding of her mother's legacy, leaving her as a solitary variable in a global conspiracy. Her isolation was her primary defense, but it also became the perfect environment for Gideon to conduct his long-term surveillance without her ever noticing. Grace's deliberate avoidance of the field is a central theme of her character development. She is a woman who is afraid of her own history, a person who has tried to erase the reporter in her blood to become a pure analyst of the state. However, the files she processes are already beginning to pull her back toward the truth. Even as she tries to hide from the past, her mother's investigative instinct is beginning to leak through her professional shell. She is the analyst of a world that is about to explode, and the silence she worked so hard to maintain is about to be shattered by the very case she didn't want. Grace Ashcroft's life at the FBI is a study in professional routine and personal clutter. Her desk is a chaotic landscape of coffee stains and case files on the mundane activities of the American Midwest. Among the piles of paper is a report she has been avoiding, a technical analysis of an unidentified disease appearing among Raccoon City survivors. This is the first mention of what would later be known as Raccoon City Syndrome, a biological anomaly that Grace has been tracking without realizing the danger it poses. Her desk is the site where the 30-year history of the contagion is finally beginning to coalesce into a terminal reality. The moment the investigation officially begins is when Nathan Dempsey drops a new assignment on her desk. He sends Grace back to the abandoned Wrenwood Hotel to investigate a fifth suspicious death associated with the mysterious survivor illness. Dempsey's motivation for giving her this specific assignment was to push Grace to finally face her fears and the trauma of her mother's death. He framed it as a low-priority inspection, unaware that the hotel was already a wired trap waiting for her return. This was not a biometric sensor conspiracy by the Bureau, but a professional push that inadvertently led Grace back into Gideon's reach. Grace's desk is more than just a piece of furniture. It is a visual representation of her internal state. The overcrowding and the late reports suggest a woman who is overwhelmed by the volume of biological suffering she is being forced to analyze. She sees the survivors of the 98 incident as data points, people who have been hollowed out by a biological debt that they can never pay. Piece together the case files on her desk, and you see the portrait of a world that is slowly collapsing under the weight of Umbrella's original sin. Grace is the only one who sees the pattern, and she is the one who wants to see it the least. Investigating mysterious deaths among Raccoon City survivors is a task that brings her into indirect contact with the legacy of Leon Kennedy and Sherry Birkin long before they ever meet. Grace is processing the medical records of the very people she will eventually have to save. This creates a narrative thread of biological inevitability. The system has placed her at the center of the web, ensuring that she is the one who holds the key to the cure, while the veterans of the franchise are the ones who are beginning to show symptoms of the disease. She is the analyst of a plague that she is destined to dismantle in the ruins of her own past. The case she didn't want is the very thing that will eventually give her life meaning. While she initially views the assignment as a professional burden and a personal nightmare, it is the first step toward reclaiming her agency as the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft. The hotel is no longer just a site of death. It is the laboratory where she will find the evidence that her mother was right. The desk at the FBI was a temporary shelter, but the Renwood is the room where she will finally face the truth. The analysis of the files is over, and the investigation of the ruins is about to begin as the daughter nobody was supposed to find is activated. Raccoon City Syndrome, or RCS, is the definitive biological threat and the final bill for the 1998 incident. It is a latent T virus mutation that manifests exactly 28 years after initial exposure, lying dormant within the survivors' cells for decades before undergoing a terminal activation. The disease manifests as black, branch-like marks appearing beneath the skin, following the neural and vascular pathways of the host. This is followed by a state of severe fatigue and total cellular collapse. It is a biological timer that was built into the original Epsilon strain, a cruelty designed to punish those who survived the city's destruction. The timing of its emergence is not a random occurrence. It is the fulfillment of a genomic schedule established by Umbrella's original researchers. The syndrome is a piece of long-term biological engineering that ensures the survivors of the franchise never truly escape the shadow of the corporation. For global society, RCS is a disease that nobody is supposed to know about, just a secret plague that the government is actively suppressing to maintain public order. This turns the veterans of the series into a hidden population of the dying, people who are being erased by their own history, while the world moves on to a more sanitized future. Leon Kennedy is exhibiting symptoms of the syndrome during the events of Resident Evil Requiem, alongside other high-profile survivors like Sherry Birkin. Throughout the campaign, the game shows Leon's condition worsening as the story progresses, reflecting the progressive nature of the cellular collapse. He is not static at one stage. His physical resilience and his tactical skill are being slowly eroded by the T-virus mutation within his blood. This adds a layer of desperate urgency to his involvement in the mission. He isn't just tracking a conspiracy. He is tracking the only potential lead to a cure for a disease that is systematically dismantling his body. The horror of Raccoon City syndrome is that it punishes the act of survival. For people like Sherry Birkin, who have already endured multiple viral infections and institutional trauma, the emergence of the black marks is the ultimate betrayal. It suggests that there was never any safety, only a stay of execution. The syndrome turns the heroes into tactical liabilities, people who can no longer trust their own bodies. This is the biological reality that connects Grace to the veterans of the series. She is the one who holds the potential antigen, while they are the ones who are being hollowed out by the original sin of Umbrella. Grace's analysis of the case files allowed her to see the pattern of RCS long before the government was ready to acknowledge it. She saw the reports of survivor fatigue and the strange markings appearing in medical clinics across the country. This knowledge is what makes her so dangerous to the establishment. She understands that the T-virus did not die in Raccoon City. It just went into a state of hibernation. The syndrome is the physical proof of the corporation's permanence, a reminder that the past is a biological engine that never stops running until the debt is paid in full or the host is consumed. Upon returning to the Wrenwood Hotel, Grace Ashcroft finds her professional detachment immediately shattered by the visceral weight of her history. The facility, left in a state of terminal decay since the 18 murder, serves as more than just a crime scene. It is a monument to a truth she had spent years trying to bury. As she moves through the dust-choked corridors, she discovers hidden surveillance logs and encrypted data drives that suggest her life had been under constant observation. The evidence implies, though never explicitly confirms, that Umbrella remnants had been tracking her movements since she was a child, treating her development like a long-term clinical study. The discovery of these logs reveals a scale of surveillance that is fundamentally chilling to anyone familiar with the reach of the pharmaceutical underground. Grace finds documentation of her school years, her medical records, and even her application to the Bureau, all meticulously filed by an entity that remained invisible to her. This suggests that the hotel was never truly abandoned, but was instead being used as a monitoring station to ensure she remained on the biological schedule that Victor Gideon required. The hotel was a trap that had been waiting for her to reach the exact maturity needed for his research. Before Grace can transmit this evidence back to the FBI, she is intercepted by Victor Gideon himself. The abduction is swift and clinical, highlighting the massive power imbalance between a technical analyst and a veteran of the most horrific research programs. Gideon explicitly states that she has finally ripened for harvest, a term that reduces her humanity to a mere agricultural variable. While the game does not show the struggle in detail, it is clear that Gideon had been waiting for this specific moment to claim her. Grace is taken from the hotel not as a prisoner of war, but as a proprietary asset being retrieved by its owner. The return to the Renwood is widely viewed as the catalyst for the modern crisis. By forcing Grace to revisit the site of her mother's death, the people in the shadows were able to confirm her status as a biological outlier. Some believe that the hotel was never about a suspicious death, but about ensuring Grace was physically isolated, so Gideon could strike without interference from the local authorities. Grace walking into that room was the final verification the scientist needed before moving his operation into its final, terminal phase. The daughter nobody was supposed to find was finally in his hands. The hotel as a trap was built the moment Alyssa died, a fact that adds a layer of retroactive horror to the 18 murder. Grace spent years believing she was running from the shadows, while the evidence suggests she was actually being monitored from a distance. One reading of the scene is that the hotel was preserved exactly as it was on the night of the murder, to ensure a specific psychological response from Grace. The Wrenwood Hotel was the beginning and the end of her silence, a place where the archive was closed and the harvest was officially initiated by the ghost of her past. Victor Gideon's interest in Grace Ashcroft is rooted in a clinical obsession with the genomic intelligence she carries. Soon after her abduction, Gideon performs a specific blood draw, an act that confirms his primary objective. He is searching for the specific antibodies produced by the daylight vaccine that Alyssa Ashcroft administered to herself in 1998. Gideon needs to verify that these antibodies survived the transition between generations, as they represent a unique biological resistance developed during the city's final hours. Grace is not a person to him, but a biological container for a 30-year-old cure. The blood draw confirms that Grace is the key required to access the final Spencer laboratory in the Raccoon City ruins. However, the confirmed lore suggests that this access is not a simple genetic scan. Instead, the facility is protected by a password that Gideon believes Grace possesses. He needs her presence because he is convinced the password is hidden within her memory, a safeguard Spencer designed to ensure only someone with a specific connection to the Ashcroft line could open the door. This makes her the most valuable tool in his arsenal, a living archive he must keep functional until the door to the ruins is reached. Gideon's methodology reveals a profound difference in how he views Grace compared to other antagonists in the series. While characters like Albert Wesker sought godhood through evolution, Gideon seeks dominance through the control of the antigen. By siphoning Grace's blood, he is attempting to understand the mechanism of the Elpis project before he ever reaches the facility. He wants to ensure that he can bypass its neutralizing effects, or perhaps repurpose it for his own ends. Grace is the subject of a clinical pursuit disguised as a kidnapping, a person whose very blood is being treated as proprietary data. Many believe this points toward a deeper connection between Gideon and the original Umbrella Guard. His knowledge of Spencer's private projects and the location of the Ark implies that he was once a high-level researcher who knew exactly what the founder was trying to hide. By focusing on Grace, Gideon is attempting to reclaim the hope that Spencer tried to bury. The blood draw is his way of verifying that the Foundling he has been tracking is indeed the one who carries the antibodies. He is a scientist who views the human spirit as nothing more than a protein structure to be mapped and exploited. Grace's role is a burden that she is only beginning to understand during these early clinical sessions. She is the literal intersection of a founder's regret and a scientist's ambition. While she is trapped in a state of fear and confusion, her blood is already beginning to dictate the course of the mission. Gideon's interest is the catalyst for her transformation from a victim into a participant, as she realizes that her own biology is the very thing everyone is fighting for. The blood draw was the first step in the harvest, and it proved that Grace Ashcroft was exactly who the survivors needed her to be. Grace's time as a captive at the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Centre provides a visceral look at the scale of Gideon's long-term experiments. The facility, which is used as a blood farm for victims of Raccoon City syndrome, is a nightmare of clinical efficiency. Grace discovers that the patients are not being treated, but are being harvested for their viral data and their genetic resistance. This is the place where the biological debt of the survivors is collected in full. A sterile abattoir where the human body is treated like a piece of industrial equipment. While exploring the facility, Grace encounters Emily, a young blind girl who is being held in a state of high security isolation. The discovery of Emily stops Grace cold as she recognizes a familiar likeness in the girl. Documents found within the center confirm that Emily is a failed prototype clone of Grace, created by the Connections in an attempt to replicate the Elpis antibodies without needing the original host. This reveal recontextualizes the surveillance Grace faced, suggesting that the Syndicate had been trying to replace her for years. Emily is the tragic evidence of their failure, a child who represents the cruelty of a science that views humanity as disposable. The interaction between Grace and Emily is where Capcom chose to encode the Ashcroft inheritance into the gameplay itself. In a direct nod to the Resident Evil Outbreak series, Grace utilizes her inherited lockpicking skills to bypass the facility's security and reach Emily's cell. Opening the first locked drawer in this section earns the player an achievement titled Like Mother, Like Daughter, a meta-narrative acknowledgement that Grace is following in Alyssa's investigative footsteps. This is the first moment Grace stops being a passive victim and begins to take on the role of a participant in the resistance. Grace choosing to protect Emily is the defining character choice of the campaign's middle act. By risking her own safety to save a child who was meant to replace her, Grace rejects the clinical logic of her captors. She sees the human being beneath the failed experiment, a reflection of the empathy that her mother taught her. This bond between the original and the replica becomes the emotional core of the mission at Rhodes Hill. It is possible that Grace sees her own lost childhood in Emily, a girl who has been trapped in a room her entire life, just as Grace was trapped in her own silence. The Rhodes Hill facility is a physical manifestation of the biodefense apparatus's rot. It shows a world where the government and private contractors work together to manage the aftermath of Umbrella's disasters, turning the survivors into a permanent resource. Grace's discovery of the blood farm and the clones proves that the war was never about a cure for the sick. It was always about the ownership of the data. By saving Emily, Grace is not just committing an act of mercy, but an act of rebellion against the system that tried to archive her. The hospital was built to wait for her, but it didn't account for a woman who knew how to pick a lock. Leon Kennedy's arrival at the Wrenwood Hotel occurs just as Gideon's van is escaping the facility, creating a narrative collision that changes the stakes of the mission. The legendary DSO agent is not there by accident. He has been tracking the emergence of Raccoon City syndrome and the mysterious disappearances of survivors for months. His presence confirms that the government was already aware of the site's importance, though they lack the specific information required to activate its secrets. Leon represents the arrival of the veterans, the people who have spent decades fighting the very monsters that Grace is only now beginning to understand. The dynamic between the two protagonists shifts the story from a solitary investigation into a desperate, tactical pursuit. Grace now has an ally who has survived every version of the biological nightmare. A man whose presence provides the proof that survival is possible even in the face of absolute horror. Leon's involvement brings the resources of the DSO and the weight of his own history to the case, but it also brings a new level of personal desperation. He is tracking the syndrome because he knows that he and Sherry Birkin are both biologically compromised, and he believes that the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft is the only lead to a cure. Leon appearing at the hotel just in time to witness the abduction is seen by many as a moment of narrative destiny. It is implied, though left deliberately vague, that his own condition was already beginning to worsen, making his mission as much about his own survival as it was about federal duty. The connection between Leon and Grace is rooted in their shared status as victims of the Umbrella legacy. Leon represents the tactical consequence of the 1998 incident, while Grace represents the biological hope. Together, they form a partnership that the board of directors never anticipated. The arrival of Leon Kennedy also signals the transition of the game into a more aggressive and high-stakes conflict. While Grace's sections are defined by puzzles and stealth, Leon's involvement introduces the tactical intensity and combat expertise that fans expect from the series. This contrast highlights the two different ways of surviving the nightmare: the analyst who documents the rot and the soldier who burns it away. However, Leon's vulnerability to the syndrome adds a layer of fragility to his character that hasn't been seen in previous entries. He is a hero who is running out of time, and his only hope is the girl in the scientist's van. Leon's arrival is the catalyst that forces Grace to accept her role in the global crisis. Seeing a man of his status fighting for his own life against the symptoms of the syndrome makes the threat visceral and real. One reading of this scene is that Leon is the one who finally pulls Grace out of her silence, forcing her to see that her biology is not a curse, but a weapon that can save those who have given everything for the world. The daughter nobody was supposed to find now has a protector who has survived the ruins before, and their bond will be the key to surviving the ruins again. The road to Raccoon City begins when a high-level government official named Zeno utilizes his clearance to freeze the official FBI investigation into Grace's abduction. This act of institutional interference forces Leon and Sherry to go rogue, burning their federal cover to pursue Gideon into the ruins of the Midwest. Zeno's motivations remain a point of intense community speculation. It is widely suggested that he is acting on behalf of a shadow syndicate that wants the Elpis antigen for themselves. By shutting down the DSO, he ensures that the mission remains a private war, away from the oversight of the international community. Leon and Sherry following Gideon into the radioactive dead zone is a journey into the heart of the series' original sin. Raccoon City remains a scarred landscape of ash and concrete, yet a place where the physical ruins are matched by the biological ghosts of the past. The return to the city is largely interpreted as a symbolic loop, a closing of the circle that began 30 years ago. For Leon, it is a return to the site of his first failure. For Grace, it is the first time she has seen the place where her mother's life was forever altered. The ruins are the only possible ending point for a story built on the debt of survivors. Gideon's apparent death during the pursuit, where he is driven off a cliff in a burning vehicle, is a narrative misdirection that the game maintains for as long as possible. Many believe this was a calculated move by Gideon to lead the survivors toward the entrance of the Ark facility without further interference. By letting Leon believe he had won, Gideon was able to descend into the ruins and prepare the final harvest in secret. This sequence emphasizes the clinical and cold nature of the antagonist, a man who views his own survival and his own body as tactical assets to be sacrificed as needed. The journey through the dead zone is defined by an atmospheric dread that mirrors the early games. The radioactive fallout has created a world where even the environment is an enemy, requiring Leon and Sherry to navigate the ruins with a level of caution that highlights their own biological vulnerability. This is the road back to the source, to the moment where the high-tech pharmaceutical fronts of the present are stripped away to reveal the industrial horror of the past. The mission is no longer about a report or a desk. It is a fight for the soul of the city that started it all. It is theorized that Spencer always intended for the final act of Project Elpis to occur in the ruins, a symbolic reset that would purge the world of the virus in the same place where it was first unleashed. As Grace and Leon move deeper into the ash, they are not just following a trail. They are walking into a trap that has been waiting for them for 3 decades. The past is a graveyard that refuses to stay buried, and the path through the dead zone is the only way to reach the truth. The veterans and the analyst are all being pulled back to the coordinates of their shared trauma. The secret umbrella facility, buried under everything hidden beneath the radioactive ash of the Raccoon City ruins, lies the Ark facility, a secret research complex commissioned by Oswell E. Spencer in the mid-90s. Unlike the sterile and industrial aesthetic of many Umbrella laboratories, some in the community have noted that the ARK serves as a black site for Spencer's most personal work. The facility represents the intersection of Umbrella's secrets and Spencer's late-life regret, buried deep beneath the failure of his original vision. It is a laboratory facility that houses the culmination of the Elpis project, protected by layers of security that have remained dormant for decades. Spencer built the Ark as a vault for the universal antigen, but he eventually realized the instability of his creations and locked the cure behind a vocal password. The lore confirms that Elpis is locked in a high-tech vault, deep under the ruins, and can only be released via an unknown password. It is implied, though left deliberately vague, that Spencer viewed this human encryption as the only way to ensure the cure was released by someone with a specific moral spine. Grace is the living guardian of a room that was built to wait for her, and she carries the only key that the board of directors cannot simply replicate. The Ark, as a physical manifestation of everything the franchise has been building toward, is a point of deep analysis for the community. It represents the intersection of Umbrella's past and the world's potential future, all in one buried complex. The high-tech terminals and the vast research bays create a sense of scale, that suggests the magnitude of Spencer's final project. One reading of this setting is that the Ark is a place where the founder buried his greatest failure and his only successful atonement together, waiting for a daughter of the ashes to find them and decide the fate of the human race. The facility's security protocols are a testament to the paranoia and the genius of the founder. He did not trust a digital safe alone. He trusted the resilience of a memory. Many believe this points toward a shift in Spencer's ideology, a belief that only a person raised away from the violence of the biodefense apparatus could be trusted with the password to global recovery. The Ark is a laboratory for hope, a stark contrast to the death factories that Umbrella built across the world. It is a facility that was designed to stay clean and hidden until the biological debt of the survivors finally came due. Grace, moving through the Arca, is the final act of her journey from analyst to sovereign. She is no longer just processing data. She is interacting with the physical legacy of the man who planned her life. The facility responds to her presence as she moves toward the master archive, its systems activating as if they have been waiting for the Ashcroft signature for decades. This creates a state of visceral, psychological tension as she moves deeper into the heart of the complex. The Ark is the final revelation of the road to Requiem, the place where the silence of the last 30 years is finally broken by the naming of the truth. In the master archive of the Ark, Grace discovers the Founding Legacy Disc, which contains a recording her mother made just before her death. The discovery of this interview changes the fundamental understanding of the mission. The disc contains footage of Alyssa Ashcroft speaking with a dying Spencer in 2006, a document that Alyssa had been protecting for nearly 20 years. In this recording, Grace experiences a memory flashback of the interview, in which Spencer refers to the T-virus as his greatest failure, and reveals he adopted an infant Grace to atone for his sins. Spencer's voice on the recording identifies Grace as his hope, revealing that he entrusted her to Alyssa because he knew the reporter who survived Raccoon City had the moral courage to keep the child away from Umbrella. This revelation provides Grace with the context for her own existence, linking her life to the regret of a man who realized too late the damage he had done. Hearing her mother's voice in the interview provides the emotional synthesis needed to bridge the gap between her trauma and her mission. So the disc is the emotional catalyst that finally dismantles the walls Grace built between herself and her past. The presence of the disc in the Ark implies, though never explicitly confirms, that Alyssa had been to the facility before her death. Many in the community believe this points toward a deeper cooperation between the reporter and the founder than the official files suggest. It is possible that Alyssa knew about the Ark and had prepared for the possibility that Grace would one day have to find it to save herself and the other survivors. This turns Alyssa's investigative legacy into a tactical roadmap for her daughter, a final gift of information from a mother who knew the price of the truth and the weight of the hope she was carrying. Spencer identifies Grace as his blind hope, a term that suggests he could never be certain if she would ever find the facility or if the antigen would even matter. He left the cure anyway, a final act of hubris disguised as a final act of mercy. The community largely interprets this as the moment Grace stops being a victim of a corporate project and becomes the architect of her own recovery. She realizes that her life was not just a clinical experiment, but a maternal legacy of truth. The reporter and the founder were both waiting for her in this room, and their voices are the ones that will guide her toward the final password. Alyssa's disk is the final document of the Raccoon City era. It proves that the truth can survive even the total destruction of a city and the silence of 3 decades. The recording provides the emotional framework for the password, linking the Greek word Elpis to the human concept of hope. As Grace and Leon listen to the dying man's confession, they are witnessing the end of the pharmaceutical myth and the birth of a new reality. The daughter nobody was supposed to find has found her own history, and she is finally ready to speak the word that will change the world. The final terminal of the ARC facility requires a vocal input to release the Elpis project, and it is here that Grace's history finally reaches its resolution. Faced with the prompt, she experiences a memory flashback to the night at the Wrenwood Hotel. She hears her mother's voice in her mind, identifying her as Hope, followed by the recording of Spencer stating that she is his hope. Grace enters the Hope password into the terminal, arriving at the answer organically through the weight of her own grief. It is an emotional synthesis of her past and her purpose, proving that the key was never a genetic scan, but a human memory. The password is the literal translation of the Greek word Elpis, and Grace speaks it aloud as an act of reclaiming her own voice. This moment is the definitive resolution of her character arc, proving that Spencer viewed her not as a weapon, but as a singular attempt at atonement. The design philosophy of Capcom in this scene emphasizes the human element. They made the most important moment in the game require no mechanical skill, only the emotional weight of a daughter's recollection. It is a moment of pure agency in a world that has been defined by viral control for 30 years. Speaking the word hope into the terminal is the act that renders the pharmaceutical legacy inert. It is widely suggested that Spencer chose this password because it was the only thing he couldn't quantify with a clinical formula. He wanted the cure to be released by someone who understood the value of life beyond its genomic utility. Grace's voice is the only thing that can unlock the reset, just a human key for a human hope. By saying the word, she is not just fulfilling a plan, but finally breaking the silence that has defined her life since the murder of her mother. The question of what the Creator desired is answered by this single word. Spencer did not desire a more powerful virus in his final days. He desired a way back from the abyss. Many in the community believe this points toward a late-life realization that the only thing more powerful than a pathogen is the resilience of the human spirit to survive it. Grace, naming the project Hope, is the symbolic end of the 1998 story, a closing of the box that Spencer opened decades ago. The ruins of Raccoon City are finally silenced by the sound of a human word that carries the weight of a generation. Ultimately, the password Hope is the final bill for 30 years of lies. It is the reset that the veterans have been waiting for, a promise that the biological debt can finally be paid in full. Grace, standing before the terminal, is the image of a world that is finally ready to heal. One reading of this scene is that the entire franchise has been moving toward this single vocal input, a moment where the complexity of the bioweapons industry is simplified into an emotional truth. The daughter nobody was supposed to find has finally spoken, and the ARK is open to provide the cure the world has been hunting. The central revelation of the final act is that Elpis is not the catastrophic bioweapon every faction had been hunting. While Xeno and the remnants of the biodefense apparatus believed they were securing a tool for global dominance, The data in the ARK confirms that Spencer's final project was a universal antigen. This substance was engineered to seek out and dismantle the protein structures of all progenitor-based weapons. It represents a total biological reset, a way to render 30 years of genetic warfare inert with a single dispersal. Grace uses the ARK's dispersal system to release the antigen, effectively neutralizing the Raccoon City syndrome that was killing the survivors. The misdirection surrounding Elpis was effective because it relied on the hubris of the survivors' enemies. Every powerful faction assumed that a secret project buried by Spencer had to be a weapon, because destruction was the only thing the man was known for. This irony is a favorite point of analysis among fans, as it shows how the greed of men like Victor Gideon blinded them to the possibility of a cure. They spent years tracking a key to a vault of salvation, believing it was an armory. By releasing Elpis, Grace is not just ending a mission. She is attempting to close the book on the pharmaceutical era once and for all. Zeno's reaction to the truth serves as the definitive proof of this hubris. Believing the vial in his hand would grant him superhuman abilities, he immediately injects himself, only to find the antigen aggressively stripping away his powers. Cured of his superhuman enhancements and reduced to a baseline human, and he is left vulnerable and easily killed by the reappeared Victor Gideon. It is a moment of visceral justice, seeing a man who sought godhood being reduced back to an ordinary state. The antigen does not kill him, it simply makes him human, which in the eyes of a man like Zeno is a far worse fate than death. The release of the antigen is often interpreted as the symbolic purification of Raccoon City. By dispersing the cure from beneath the ash of the 98 disaster, the game suggests a return to a natural order. The black marks on Leon's skin begin to fade as the antigen works through his system, proving that Spencer's hope was real. While it does not undo the 30 years of suffering, it provides a horizon for a future where the virus is no longer a permanent death sentence. The antigen targets the specific genomic signatures that define the various outbreaks, erasing the biological debt of those who survived the past. The truth about Elpis is that it was designed to be the final word in the war against Umbrella. Spencer created a substance that could overwrite the entire history of the progenitor virus, a total victory of the antigen over the pathogen. By placing this power in the hands of Grace, he ensured that it would be used as a gift rather than a weapon. The antigen represents the end of the nightmare, and the birth of a world where the human race is no longer a proprietary resource. Grace has successfully released the hope that was left in the box, and the pharmaceutical myth is finally rendered inert. The climax of the mission is interrupted by the return of Victor Gideon, who reveals the true extent of his own radicalization. After murdering Zeno, Gideon reveals that he has integrated the Nemesis strain into his own biology, self-injecting a concentrated T-type variant he had been refining for decades. He mutates into a massive, multi-limbed horror that manages to retain his human intelligence, creating a confrontation that represents the ultimate synthesis of Umbrella's research. Documents found in nearby terminals confirm the Nemesis strain is now in its gamma stage and is being mass-produced, suggesting Gideon is the alpha of a new breed of industrial horror. The battle against the monstrous Gideon requires Leon and Grace to utilize their combined skills to survive his overwhelming power. Leon finishes Victor Gideon's Nemesis form using the Requiem pistol, a moment of high-stakes spectacle that marks the end of the scientist's long obsession. Gideon's transformation is a nightmare of clinical horror. showing a man who believed in the science so much that he allowed it to consume him. He was never just a researcher looking for a payday. He was a man who chose to become the very weapon he spent his life studying. The fight is a struggle between the hope of the antigen and the malice of the nemesis strain. While never shown on screen, it is theorized that Gideon's burns from the Wrenwood fire may have influenced the way the nemesis strain mutated his flesh. Many in the community believe this points toward a personal vendetta that drove him to focus his final form's aggression on Grace. Gideon represents the man who sought to reclaim the Umbrella legacy through force, a stark contrast to the heroes who are fighting to be cured of its effects. The battle in the Ark is the final reckoning for the scientist who viewed Grace as a ripening asset rather than a human being. Gideon's return recontextualizes his entire character arc. He was the one who tracked the Ashcroft line for years, waiting for the perfect moment to initiate the harvest. By becoming a monster, he finally discards the mask of the researcher to embrace the raw power of the virus. He represents the end of the pharmaceutical era's refinement, a creature of pure destruction that retains the ego of its human host. The destruction of his primary heart is the definitive end of the Umbrella remnants at the Ark, proving that the science of the past cannot withstand the truth of the present. The confrontation with the monstrous Gideon marks the end of the pharmaceutical myth. He dies as a failed experiment in the ruins of the city that started it all, his ambition buried beneath the collapsing facility. Leon and Grace's victory is a testament to the resilience of the survivors against the most advanced biological engineering. As the Ark begins to shut down, the threat of the nemesis Gamma strain is temporarily halted, leaving the world with a chance to heal. Gideon's obsession ended in the ash, and the road to Requiem has finally led to the defeat of the man who started it all. After dispatching the monstrous Gideon, Leon and Grace find themselves trapped within the Ark facility as it begins to shut down. The structural collapse and the failing lights create a sense of terminal finality as the heroes accept their potential fate in the ruins. Suddenly, a bright light shines down from above, revealed to be a group of soldiers who have breached the facility using a heavy drill bore. This rescue is a moment of massive relief. She's showing that the veterans of the biodefense community were monitoring the situation from the shadows. The arrival of the soldiers provides the necessary muscle to ensure that Grace and a rejuvenated Leon make it out before the ruins are permanently sealed. One of the soldiers tells Leon that he has a message from Chris Redfield, a detail that confirms the involvement of the legendary captain in the extraction. Among the squad is Umber Eyes, a confirmed member of the elite unit sent to retrieve the survivors. The rescue serves as a significant structural echo of the 98 incident, as Leon is once again extracted from the coordinates of Raccoon City. This closing of the loop suggests a finality to his journey within the Midwest, marking the end of his longest and most personal mission. The veterans are the ones who pull the analyst and the hero out of the earth just seconds before the facility is lost forever. The physical extraction occurs as the ruins of the city are permanently sealed by a subterranean cave-in. This implies that while the cure was saved, much of the remaining research within the Ark may have been lost in the rubble. It is possible that this collapse was a deliberate failsafe built into the facility by Spencer, a way to ensure that if the antigen was ever activated, the laboratory would be destroyed to prevent its misuse by the Shadow Syndicates. The ruins of Raccoon City have finally claimed the last physical secrets of the Umbrella Corporation, leaving only the survivors to tell the story. For Grace, the sight of the soldiers descending through the ceiling is the visual language of her own recovery. She has survived the room that was built for her and has come out the other side as a witness to the truth. The rescue is the beginning of her new life, a transition from a hidden asset to a recognized survivor, just as she sits in the back of the transport, watching the radioactive dead zone disappear into the distance. She is the physical embodiment of the hope that Spencer spent his final years trying to preserve. The silence of the last 8 years has finally been broken by a successful rescue. The arrival of Umber Eyes and the message from Chris Redfield link the events of the arc directly to the broader global conflict. It shows that Grace is no longer an isolated analyst, but is now part of the legacy of those who have dedicated their lives to fighting bioterrorism. The rescue is the final act of the road to Requiem, a moment of high-stakes extraction that proves the heroes are never truly alone. As the squad departs the ruins, the world is left with the antigen and the report that will change the political landscape forever. The daughter nobody was supposed to find has been saved by the people who have seen it all before. Part 20. Leon's Cure. The Rejuvenation. Grace injects Leon with a dose of Elpis, an act that successfully erases the Raccoon City syndrome from his blood and halts the terminal cellular collapse. The confirmed lore states that Leon is rejuvenated and feels better than ever after receiving the antigen, allowing him to take down the monstrous Gideon in the final moments of the conflict. This cure represents a total victory over the biological debt he has carried since '98, halting the black tendrils and restoring his physical vitality. Leon is the first high-profile survivor to be purified by Spencer's final project, proving that the hope in the box was real. While the ending confirms that Leon is rejuvenated, many in the community have speculated based on early leaks that this implies a physical de-aging process. This popular theory suggests that the antigen rewrites the damaged cells back to their original state, effectively resetting the biological clock of the host. However, the game itself leaves this deliberately vague, focusing instead on Leon's return to peak strength. Whether he is physically younger or simply restored to his prime, the result is a legendary hero who is no longer being consumed by his own history. He has been given a second chance at a life unaffected by the virus. The lore implication for other survivors like Sherry Birkin is profound. If the antigen can rejuvenate a veteran who has been exposed to multiple viral strains, it offers a horizon for the recovery of everyone suffering from the syndrome. It is theorized that this was Spencer's ultimate goal, to provide a reset for the people whose lives his corporation destroyed. By rendering the viral weapons inert and restoring the health of the survivors, the Elpis antigen closes the book on the pharmaceutical era's biological legacy. The cure is the final act of the pharmaceutical myth, turning a plague into a recovery. Leon's rejuvenation is a definitive statement on the power of the Elpis project. It proves that the universal antigen can overwrite decades of genetic damage, a feat that no other medical intervention had achieved. He is no longer the compromised analyst that Gideon wanted to harvest. He is just Leon Kennedy again, a man who has been given back his strength by the daughter of a reporter. The disconnect between his veteran mind and his restored body will likely define his character in the future, as he navigates a world where he is no longer physically dying from his past. As Leon looks at the results of the cure in the final moments, he is the living proof that the nightmare can be dismantled. The antigen did not just save his life, It simplified his biology, removing the viral fragments that had defined his service for 30 years. One reading of this scene is that Leon has finally been allowed to leave Raccoon City, not just geographically, but biologically. He has been reset to his original state, a survivor who has finally found the way through the ash to a future that is clean and full of strength. In the game's epilogue, Grace Ashcroft is shown back at her desk with the FBI, a detail that confirms she remains within the Bureau, despite the institutional rot she uncovered. She is no longer a hidden asset in a cage, but a professional who has reclaimed her agency and her identity. Grace is seen publishing her report through official channels, ensuring that her findings are made public and that the truth about the Outbreak and the connections is impossible to ignore. This transition from a lonely analyst to a whistleblower marks the final evolution of her character arc as she takes on the responsibility of the truth. Grace is seen with 2 framed photographs on her desk, which serve as the emotional anchors of her new life. One is an old image of her and her mother, Alyssa, a reminder of the investigative legacy she inherited. The other is a photograph of her with Emily, the child she rescued from the Rhodes Hill laboratory. Emily is confirmed to have been cured and now lives with Grace, who seemingly serves as her adopted mother. This bond between the original and the replica is the definitive victory over the clinical logic of Gideon, proving that the human spirit cannot be archived or prototyped. The final scene at the desk is a powerful rejection of the silence that defined Grace's life for 8 years. She is no longer hiding behind a desk to avoid her history, and she is using that desk as a platform to dismantle the pharmaceutical myth. It is implied, though never explicitly confirmed, that she has taken on the role of a silent guardian for Emily, ensuring the child has the peaceful life that Alyssa always wanted for Grace. They are 2 survivors who have found a new way to live in a world that once viewed them as proprietary research. Grace's decision to publish her report through the FBI is a tactical move that ensures her findings are protected by the federal record. She completes her mother's work by utilizing the very system she once tried to hide within, turning the institutional archive into a weapon of accountability. This choice suggests that Grace believes in the power of documentation to force a reckoning with the past. She is the analyst who turned the files against the people who wrote them, and ensuring that the 30 years of lies are finally dismantled in the eyes of the public. The epilogue shows a world that is beginning to heal. Grace and Emily are the living evidence that Spencer's hope was successful, and the publication of the report ensures that the biodefense apparatus can no longer operate in the shadows. The final image of the 2 photographs is a symbol of a bridge successfully built between the trauma of the past and the potential of the future. Grace Ashcroft started as a daughter nobody was supposed to find, and she ended as the woman who ensured the world would never forget the truth. Part 22. Grace's Report, the Manifesto of Truth. The confirmed contents of Grace's report provide the final clinical reckoning for the pharmaceutical era. She documents how the 19th century Connections Syndicate predates the Umbrella Corporation. She's revealing a hidden architecture of power that has been managing biological nightmares for over a century. The report also reveals that the 1998 thermobaric missile strike was not designed solely for containment, but to shift the blame for illegal biological activities onto Oswell E. Spencer. This tactical move allowed the government to distance itself from the disaster, while the corporations continued their research in secret. Grace's findings also touch on the role of Brandon Bailey, framing him as a mere cog in a much larger and more ancient wheel of eugenics and biological control. The manifesto provides the proof that the truth cannot be buried, documenting the DSO's manipulation of survivors and the reality of the Raccoon City syndrome. By making these findings public, Grace has ensured that the era of managed biological security is over. The world now knows about the Ark, the antigen, and the syndicate, and the fallout from this revelation will likely define the political landscape of the franchise for years to come. The report serves as the final document of the Raccoon City era, a bridge that connects the pharmaceutical wars of the past to the institutional horror of the present. Grace turned the skills she learned as an analyst at the Bureau into a weapon of accountability, proving that a federal document can be just as lethal as a journalistic expose. She has successfully mapped the true shape of the enemy, providing a roadmap for future investigations into the shadow syndicates. Her work is the final act of a professional who has chosen the truth over the safety of the institution. Many in the community have speculated that the report includes evidence of a 19th century eugenic society that birthed the modern syndicates, a theory that adds a deeper historical layer to the lore. While this specific detail remains unconfirmed in the primary sources, the manifesto itself is the physical proof that the bioweapons industry has a much older and more complex history than previously believed. Grace has forced the world to look at the foundations of the biological nightmare, ensuring that the legacy of the Ashcroft line is one of total exposure rather than quiet compliance. Grace's manifesto is the act that renders the pharmaceutical myth inert in the eyes of the public. It is a document of 30 years of lies, a final bill that the establishment is now forced to pay. By submitting this report through official channels, Grace has reclaimed her own voice and her mother's investigative spirit. The daughter nobody was supposed to find has become the woman who told the world the truth they were never supposed to hear. The report is the final victory of the analyst over the archive, a testament to the power of a single person to change the world. Part 23. Like mother, like daughter. The two photographs. The final image of Resident Evil Requiem finds Grace Ashcroft at her desk within the FBI, a symbolic return to where her journey began, but with a fundamental shift in her perspective. She is no longer an analyst hiding from her history, but a woman who has successfully integrated her past into her professional reality. On her desk are two framed photographs that serve as the defining visual language of the ending. One is an old image of her and her mother, Alyssa, a tribute to the reporter who started the mission in '98. The other is a photograph of her with Emily, the child who represents the future she has chosen to protect. The confirmed final image is Grace at her desk with these two photographs, a moment of atmospheric peace that suggests a world beginning to heal. She is not sitting at a typewriter in a new home, but is instead using the very institution she once feared as a platform for her truth. This choice highlights her role as a professional witness, someone who is dedicated to ensuring that the events of the Arak and the syndrome are officially recorded and remembered. The daughter and the mother are joined in the archive, proving that the Ashcroft legacy has successfully moved from journalism to the federal record. While the typewriter exists within the ARK as a save point mechanic, it is the two photographs at the desk that carry the emotional weight of the conclusion. They represent the successful bridge between the trauma of Raccoon City and the hope of the antigen. Grace has taken on the role of Emily's guardian, a choice that mirrors Alyssa's own protective spirit. The photographs are a silent testament to the resilience of the human spirit to survive even the most clinical and cold biological nightmares. They are the only things in the Bureau that are not a data point or a file. Nathan Dempsey, calling for her at the end, is met with a sense of quiet authority from Grace, a contrast to the fear she felt at the beginning of the mission. She is no longer a subordinate to be manipulated, but a survivor who knows the truth about the system. Many in the community believe this points toward a future where Grace acts as a key figure in the ongoing investigation into the shadow syndicates. She has moved from being a victim of the harvest to being the one who watches the watchers. The daughter nobody was supposed to find is now the woman the establishment can no longer ignore. Ultimately, the two photographs represent the meaning of the title Requiem. They are a memorial to those who were lost and a promise to those who remain. Grace at her desk is the final image of a world that is being recorded honestly. A story of 30 years of lies dismantled by a single, determined person. As she looks at the images of the people she loves, she is the physical embodiment of the hope that Spencer spent his final years trying to preserve. The road to Requiem has ended at her desk, and the truth is finally in the light. Part 24, Outbreak's Canon, the foundation of the story. Resident Evil Requiem serves as the definitive confirmation that the events of the Resident Evil Outbreak series are fully canon within the primary timeline of the franchise. By making Alyssa Ashcroft's survival and her investigative work the literal foundation of Grace's DNA and the entire plot of the 9th game, Capcom has firmly integrated the survivor stories of 1998 into the main lore. For decades, the community has wondered if the characters who escaped the city were part of the real story, and Grace's existence provides the final, undeniable answer. This canonization recontextualizes the entire emotional architecture of the franchise. The struggle of the ordinary citizens in Raccoon City is no longer side content. It is the catalyst for the modern global crisis. Alyssa's reporting is the reason that the truth about Umbrella was ever revealed, and her biological resilience is the reason that Leon Kennedy is still alive in the current era. This shift in perspective honors the history of the series, while giving a new weight to the experiences of the non-military survivors. The lore of 1998 has been expanded to include the voices that were originally meant to be silenced. The implication for other Resident Evil Outbreak characters is a major point of discussion among fans. If Alyssa's story was this important, many wonder if we will eventually see the legacy of other characters like Kevin Ryman or Cindy Lennox. It is theorized that their own escapes may have also left behind biological or institutional threads that are waiting to be pulled in future games. By opening the door to the Outbreak canon, Capcom has created a vast new landscape for lore exploration, proving that every person who survived the city has a story that matters to the complete timeline. Capcom's choice of a civilian journalist as the mother of a franchise centerpiece is a radical and refreshing lore decision. It moves the series away from the perspective of super soldiers and toward the perspective of ordinary people caught in an extraordinary nightmare. Grace is the daughter of a reporter, not a commando, and her victory is one of analysis and documentation rather than pure firepower. This highlights the theme that the truth is the only thing that can truly render the bioweapon inert. The legacy of the Outbreak survivors is the triumph of the human spirit over industrial slaughter. The final reflection on Grace's journey highlights her role as the instrument of truth in a world of biological lies. While Chris and Leon are instruments of war, shaped by the violence they have fought for decades, Grace is the one who remains human and grounded. Spencer called her his hope because she was the only thing he created that was not intended to be a weapon. By confirming the Outbreak canon through her story, the game proves that the answer to the biological nightmare was never going to be a better soldier, but a better witness. The daughter nobody was supposed to find has finally brought the story home. Part 25. The Meaning of Grace, the Human Variable. Grace Ashcroft represents a fundamental shift in the identity of the franchise and the way we interpret the concept of a hero. For 30 years, the world of survival horror has been saved by specialized agents, elite commandos, gear and bioweapon experts who were hardened by the violence of the pharmaceutical era. Characters like Chris Redfield or Leon Kennedy are instruments of war, shaped by a constant exposure to the viral nightmare and the institutional rot of the biodefense apparatus. Grace, however, is a quiet intelligence analyst who spent her adulthood hiding behind a desk to avoid the very history she carries in her blood. The meaning of her victory lies in its lack of violence. She did not dismantle the biological nightmare with firepower, but with a report, a memory, and a moral spine. Spencer calling Grace his hope, or Elpis, carries a profound weight when viewed through the lens of his final years. Many believe this points toward a clinical realization, on his part, that the only thing he could not corrupt was an ordinary human life raised far away from his laboratories. By placing the fate of the ARC project in the hands of a Foundling, Spencer was effectively admitting that his science had failed to produce anything of lasting value. He created a world defined by monsters, and he understood that only a soft human spirit could reset the biological world he had broken. The community largely interprets this as the final act of a man who realized that hope was the only thing left worth protecting after 30 years of industrial slaughter. The idea of growing up honest in a world built on lies is the moral anchor of the entire Ashcroft legacy. While Alyssa Ashcroft fought the Umbrella Corporation with her camera and her typewriter, Grace fought the Shadow syndicates with her files and her professional analysis. It is theorized that her time at the Bureau, despite the institutional rot she discovered there, actually gave her the tools needed to see through the corporate masks of the modern era. She was never supposed to find the truth, yet her innate investigative honesty made the discovery inevitable. Many fans suggest that her victory is a tribute to the power of the individual witness over the massive, faceless machinery of the state. She proved that one person, standing at a desk, can be more dangerous to a syndicate than a battalion of soldiers. As the 30-year loop that began in Raccoon City finally reaches its conclusion, the meaning of Grace becomes a symbol of closure. She is the bridge between the tragedy of the 1998 incident and the potential of a clean future. The rejuvenation of Leon Kennedy and the recovery of Emily are the physical manifestations of the reset she triggered within the ARC facility. By choosing to become a guardian for the child who was meant to be her replacement, Grace ensures that the next generation will grow up in the sunlight she and her mother were never allowed to enjoy. So one reading of this resolution is that Grace has successfully paid the biological debt of the survivors, providing a requiem for the pharmaceutical era that allows the veterans to finally find a sense of peace. In the final reckoning of the story, the meaning of Grace is the triumph of the human element over the biological machine. She started her journey as an isolated analyst, afraid of her own history, and she ended it as the guardian of the truth. While the soldiers continue their war in the shadows, Grace provides the world with a definitive document that dismantles the pharmaceutical myth. She is the proof that the answer to the nightmare was never going to be a better weapon, but a better person. As she sits at her desk with the photographs of her family, the silence of the last 3 decades is replaced by a sense of quiet authority. Grace Ashcroft is the hope that was left in the box, and she has finally brought the story of the daughter nobody was supposed to find to a dignified and human end.